Hello and welcome to another episode of Highway to Hill, a pro-Congress podcast about the messiest and most important branch of government. I'm Charlie Hunt, political scientist at Boise State University. As always, I am joined by SoRelle Gaynor from University of Virginia. How's it going, SoRelle?
It's going, Charlie.
Yeah, it's always going here and in Congress, so we're gonna get into it. Today on Highway to Hill, we're gonna update you on the partial government shutdown, how long it might last, what it is we're fighting over, where things might go, some related updates around requests for spending from the White House that maybe actually are getting ignored, and then we're going to talk about the wonderful world of earmarks in the budget. So it's all about the Benjamins today. Mm-hmm. So, SoRelle, let's start out with our explainer. We have officially moved into this partial shutdown that we kind of previewed a couple of weeks ago. We're in it now. The Department of Homeland Security is officially, or ostensibly anyways, shut down. What does that look like in this situation as opposed to what we had last year where we had the entire government shut down for, upwards of a month and a half?
It really is wild. It feels like we're not even in a shutdown, right? It's so different. Democrats were able to separate DHS funding from the other appropriations bills. So the DHS funding bill is the only one that didn't pass into law. And so technically, DHS is the only agency that's shut down, and even still not all of it. You really wouldn't be able to tell. So, for instance, air traffic controllers are covered under Department of Transportation. So that part of the airport's fine. TSA agents are covered under DHS. For this type of agency shutdown, the agency has a plan in place. And so they can kind of figure out how long they can go by either having their workers go without pay, or they have a contingency plan in place. ICE, however, which is kind of what the DHS shutdown is all about, is totally separate. And I'll let you handle why that is, Charlie.
Well, it's so interesting. There are a lot of ways in which, even beyond it just being a partial shutdown, it's really different from previous shutdowns. There are the things that are the same, like you said. They're agencies understand that shutdowns can happen, and they have plans in place. And, the TSA is shut down, but much like during the last shutdown, you have folks. It's not that there are no TSA agents anymore. They're just working without pay, which is not ideal, obviously. And that can compound as an issue the longer the shutdown goes on. But the interesting thing here is, number one, that DHS is separated out. And number two, that within DHS, the shutdown does not necessarily mean that all of these different sub-agencies within DHS are going to just not operate or not get paid. And part of that is because, thanks to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act last year, sort of the Trump's kind of signature domestic legislation that was, a couple $1 trillion, a whole lot of that funding went to specifically immigration enforcement, sub-agencies like ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. So those two agencies, sub-agencies, interestingly enough, are ones that are not going to be as affected by the partial shutdown. Meanwhile, other agencies, you mentioned TSA, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, 85% of these employees are going to keep working without pay. I mean, I'm curious what you think about this in thinking about leverage for the Democrats and how this is going to end up. Because if Democrats are trying to inflict pain here, right, in order to kind of get what they want, is it fair to say that the pain is going in not the places they would have hoped it would go, right? To TSA and FEMA as opposed to ICE and CBP? If that's the case, then what's being accomplished here?
I mean, I think there is some benefit into trying to use this moment to leverage, right? Because it is an appropriations bill. So it is going to determine funding for the fiscal year, albeit this is later than it should have passed, as we talked about, way back when. This is, they're turning in their homework late, right?
Yes.
But it does determine the spending levels. And like we talked about, this is a chance for them to put into law these riders. And so there's a letter out, we will link it in our Substack, that has the demands that Democrats have. And I think it's helpful for us to think of this as classic negotiating, right? They're going to put all their demands on the table. So some of these are things like ICE not wearing masks, targeted enforcement, which is not entering properties without a judicial warrant, which is the law.
Sure.
So,
Right.
But anyways, might as well restate it. Racial profiling. Again, this gets into that Supreme Court case. Use of force standards, etc. There's 10 requests. I would imagine they'd be happy with half of these, right? These would be reforms to an agency. But, like you said, most of the funding has already been distributed through a different law. And so it's important to differentiate that agencies and all sort of federal programs can be funded in two ways. One, through sort of this reauthorization policy bill, like the One Big Beautiful Bill, or through the appropriation. So this is just a tool that the minority has. But what do you think, Charlie? Do you think this is even worth the potential public backlash of another Democrat shutdown?
I mean, it could be. In a couple of ways, I think it is worth it, even given the sort of devil's advocate side I sort of gave a minute ago, which is that, like, they're in the minority in both chambers. They don't have the presidency. This has been true the entire time while they've sort of watched, the executive branch sort of run roughshod over power of the purse and all of these other powers that Congress is supposed to have. And so, I think it's good to try to reassert this authority in some way. I mean, it's strange because, like, I saw a couple of different perspectives on whether separating out DHS and doing the partial shutdown was the right thing to do. And even, like, a more granular version of this I'm seeing right now is, well, maybe we agree to fund TSA and FEMA if the Republicans will go along with it, and then isolate out ICE and CBP, which on the one hand, like, lessens the damage from the shutdown. And so, maybe that's a good thing to do, and funding TSA is a good thing to do so we can be safe in our airplanes. But on the other hand, that also lessens your leverage, right? If you're trying to, like, inflict pain and try to get something out of it. Like, I am not a game theorist, and I am glad I am not in the Democratic leadership for many, many reasons. But that seems like they're trying to sort of find some interesting middle path between those things, and I don't really know what the best way forward is for them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that it is less harmful, which if we look at the last shutdown, Democrats didn't really get much, but they did get this, shutdown narrative. Whether voters remember that or not, I'm skeptical. To your point is that by allowing a larger scale shutdown to go on, you do give the administration some ability to kind of operate how they want. And this is the other piece that you mentioned, right? Which is that Russell Vought has used this to his advantage. And by Congress going ahead and passing those other appropriations bills and saying, this is the law, this is how we've written and how we've negotiated it, it is a good thing for Congress to do, rather than shutting down the whole thing and letting the agency decide what they want to keep open and what they want to take advantage of shutting down.
Yeah, so maybe some lessons learned from the last shutdown and from the administration's sort of behavior in this area over the last, 18 months or whatever it is. So, we don't know what's going to happen next. We see, SoRelle, a lot of public statements, snippy statements on both ends of things. Should we assume that these public statements, the press conferences, that these are not the only deliberations that are happening, that you've got staff and leadership and rank and file and other folks meeting with the White House and meeting with the other party in Congress? Or are they just, like, lobbing water balloons in the press?
I think that this shutdown, especially compared to the last one, is much more subdued in messaging. I mean, those of you who followed the last shutdown, you would go to any government agency and there'd be a big banner across the top, which is a violation of the Hatch Act, possibly. But it was, the Democrats shut down, and members of Congress Republican members were all unified in this messaging. We're not really seeing that, in part because it is a smaller shutdown. Now, if you go to, I was looking actually at the Department of Homeland Security's website this morning. That is, kind of the front page, talking about the shutdown. But it's not a full-scale messaging. And I found this quote from Punchbowl News, which is a newsletter, a Capitol Hill newsletter. I found it a good indicator of what's going on. They said, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries has dismissed the White House submissions as not serious. We have no reason to doubt them, but because the Trump administration hasn't publicly released any information on its offers to Democrats, we take this as a sign that the talks are serious, right? So that there's not a lot of leaking or talking about, how they don't like any of these Democratic proposals. Even Russell Vogt mentioned, we're looking to come to a bipartisan solution to end this shutdown, right? That language was not around in December. So I think that is a sign that there's actual negotiating going on.
For sure. And I think it also, and who knows how long it'll take, but I think it also is indicative of, there's been discussion around will the Republicans ditch the filibuster over this in order to, because they need these, 7 or 8 Democrats to get on board to reach cloture and get that 60 vote threshold on this. And the question is, whether the GOP will just be like, no, this is the last straw. We're getting rid of the filibuster. Lots of Republican senators have said they have no interest in doing that. And I think you're right that these relatively tame public statements are sort of indicative of this. And the other thing here, too, is in looking back at the previous shutdown, the White House is thinking, maybe they came out okay or the public forgot or things like that. And maybe they'll just do what they did last time, which is kind of not budging and not giving the Democrats really much that they want and waiting for them to sort of break under the pressure. And I'm wondering if that might be less possible than last time because of this recent public opinion kind of slide that we have seen, particularly since the Renee Good and Alex Preddy killings, on ICE specifically and Trump's general approval on the immigration issue on the whole. Do you think maybe the Democrats are feeling emboldened and they don't need to be so afraid to engage on this anymore?
Yeah, public opinion is definitely in their favor here. 60% of those polled, Republicans and Democrats, all voters, view ICE unfavorably. I mean, we can look at Tom Homan coming out and saying we're going to leave Minnesota, even though it appears they really haven't, but at least they've started that drawdown process. But yeah, ICE remains unpopular. Another woman was killed by them in Georgia this week. Linda Davis, her car was rammed into while they were chasing someone else on the street, right? So there's no good news really coming out about ICE, right? The stats are showing that they're doing things like deporting children, right? So it's not, the request and the want for policy changes are definitely there among voters, even a lot of Republican voters. And that's definitely leverage that Democrats have and that they didn't have in December. The question is, will the White House just stick it out like they did last time, right? That strategy of not budging at all did work for them last time. So that could also be what they're doing, which is just being quiet and letting things pass over.
And SoRelle, this is reminding me of, another interesting story we saw published the other day in the New York Times. They did this deep dive into the White House's submitted budget, proposed budget that they put before Congress. It proposed, things like 54% cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency, the agency we talked about last week, 44% cuts to Housing and Urban Development, 41% cuts to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, all manner of agencies. And then they compared those requested cuts to what Congress actually enacted. And I assume you feel the same way I do in that you were pleased maybe to see that Congress held firm in a lot of its cuts and additions and did not really seem to follow their blueprint very much, except in a couple of areas. Why do you think that is?
Yes, this made me very proud. I think this is exactly what we were talking about, though, which is the benefit of passing appropriations rather than either a shutdown or a continuing resolution. Again, Congress's choice to separate DHS was them saying, no, we already have figured out how much we want to spend on these other agencies, and we're going to pass this into law, right? This is our job. So like you said, they requested 54% cuts from EPA, but Congress only enacted 4% cuts. So I was very proud to see this. And I think it shows that, the appropriations process is still working to some degree.
Yeah, and that, presidents always submit budgets. They don't always do it on time, but they, it's become just the way things work that they submit their proposed budgets and then Congress has their own response. In general, I'm sort of iffy about the whole concept of the White House proposing a budget since it is supposed to be in Congress's corner. On the other hand, they do have the veto power and they can veto a budget, and so it's important to know where they stand. But it's also, I feel like these numbers are an indication of what we already knew about presidential budget requests, which is that, they're closer to a campaign document than they are to actual enacted law, right? That they're a wish list, and then Congress ultimately gets to decide. And I feel like it's an indicator of what we know about the budget process, which is that once a lot of these things are in the budget, it's much more difficult to pull them out than to put new stuff back in, right? That these budgets are sticky, that appropriators cutting 54% of the EPA, even under a Republican administration, would be so logistically difficult that it's not a simple matter of just taking that money out of the bank account.
Right.
And that there's a lot more that goes on that I think Congress understands better than the White House does.
Yeah, it's a negotiating tactic at the end of the day to say this is what we want. But just like Democrat requests for DHS reforms, there's some give in there. So it's good to put it all out on the table and then work backwards, I think.
So let's go to our next segment. We're going to stay on sort of the budget and money train right now, get into some important Congress vocab that I think, many folks may have heard of, but maybe don't have the best understanding of. We're hopeful maybe we can add some color to your understanding here. And that is around this idea of earmarks in the budget. So this is stemming from an article in Roll Call earlier this week, another lovely Congress-related publication. They do awesome work. And that the title of this article was Earmarks Flood Spending Bills After a Year's Hiatus. And Roll Call basically did this analysis and laid out that although a lot of the continuing resolution from last year that passed sort of that temporary budget wiped out a whole bunch of earmarks, which are these sort of home state or home district projects that members of Congress like to get funded in small amounts in the budget. Lawmakers, quote, rebounded and have enacted nearly $15.5 billion in earmarked funding for fiscal 2026 so far. So, SoRelle, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about earmarks? We're funding all these other parts of the government, but we also have these smaller projects. What's going on here?
There's a negative connotation to them for sure. Sometimes they're referred to as pork barrel projects. The technical term that Congress prefers to use now is community-focused grant program.
That does sound a lot better.
Yes, isn't that nice?
Yeah.
So earmarks are essentially funding for regional projects. So you have a big transportation bill, you want to get a bridge in your district funded, you're going to request an earmark in the transportation appropriations spending bill. Leaders use them for, like we've been talking about, for negotiation purposes, right? They want to get their members on board to spending bills. And so they'll say, well, what do you need? What in your district can we fund for you? Obviously, rank and file members like them too, because there's a lot of great work about how members will write home and talk about their earmarks, talk about the programs that they've won for their district. But you can really just think of them as like grant awards for the district.
Yeah, and so they're negotiating chits in a lot of these instances so they can sort of grease the wheels a little bit in some of these larger negotiations around bigger budget items. This has opened the door to both, I think good and bad projects, popular and unpopular projects. So these are typically things like highway repair or like building a new senior center or like waterway projects or something like that are specific to a particular place in a member's district or home state. But there have also been, bad apple sort of examples. The classic one was this bridge to nowhere project in Alaska back in the 2000s that cost like $250 million and connected, two islands in Alaska that had like a few dozen people on each of them. And it was, these things can be viewed as like members, hogging the public taxpayer money and using it for themselves on these, in some cases, maybe wasteful projects. And that led, after the Bridge to Nowhere and some of these other projects, to a 10-year moratorium on earmarks that was enacted in 2010. There were a number of other scandals in this area in the mid-2000s that sort of combined with, after Obama got elected in 2008, a lot of these sort of Tea Party kind of smaller government-focused movements that were intent on, identifying spots in the budget where we could make major cuts. And of course, nobody actually wants to cut the big things like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. So we can go after these smaller projects that maybe we can write some bad headlines about. And so that led to this moratorium in 2010. But we recently did get them back a few years ago.
Yeah, so people love to campaign against Congress, and so there are all these scandals, the Abramoff scandal, some other ones that kind of got lumped in with this, like, what is Congress spending its money on? So earmarks were really easy to cut. The other reason they were easy to cut is that they are an example of a rule, not a law. And so to have earmarks in Congress or not is really just up to the decision of the leaders, right? So at the start of every congressional session, Congress passes a rules package. This also includes like what committees people are going to be on. Are we going to allow for proxy voting? All of these sorts of decisions. And one of them, at the party level, the party leaders got to decide, do we want to have earmarks? And so following these scandals and this Tea Party movement, there became this moratorium passed at the party level, which is, how it kind of got institutionalized. Now, when I worked for the House Modernization Committee starting in 2019, there was talk again of reinstating these earmarks. They called them community-focused grant programs. It was a very long back and forth process with appropriators, Speaker Pelosi at the time, about what we wanted this to look like. And now what the program looks like is much more transparent than it used to be, right? So earmarks used to be, I'm going to call the speaker up and ask if he can throw something in for me or vice versa. Now it's very formalized. Lawmakers have to first receive a request from their district for spending on a specific project. So, members can't pull something out of thin air. And then they have to fill out a form that you can get online from the appropriators. And you can only submit up to 10 projects for your district, right? And then appropriators will kind of go through them and decide what to spend. And it is more transparent than it used to be. I think it was a great, outcome of ModCom and appropriators working together. How much money are we talking here, though, Charlie?
Not nearly as much as people think. As usual with Congress, and this is the same conversation we have around things like, members' salaries or like staff salaries, or foreign aid is another great example that I have the feeling that if you ask the public, if you polled the public, like how much of the federal budget is spent on earmarks or these like pork barrel projects, they'd probably say like 20 or 30% at least. And the actual answer is usually less than 1%, especially after this new proposal that you just talked about. So earmarks were capped at 1% of discretionary budget authority, which again is just the part of the federal budget that is, as the name implies, discretionary, right? You can move the money around and decide. It's sort of optional budget authority, as opposed to the much bigger parts of the budget, right? Which are these entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security that take up like well over half of the actual federal budget. Mm-hmm. So in reality, right, we are talking about like, 0.02, 0.01% of the entire federal budget. And so if our, like, for example, we mentioned the Tea Party earlier, like if our concern is the increasing debt and deficit, earmarks are the absolutely wrong place to look if you're looking to make any kind of actual impact. That doesn't mean they're a good idea, but I'm curious, SoRelle, like, what do you think about earmarks? Like, should we have, you worked on this proposal, but like, are they a good thing?
I'm an earmark fan. I think it's Article 1 power. I think, this money gets delegated out regardless of how if Congress decides to or not, right? So you have an appropriations bill, X amount of money is going to Veterans Affairs. Would you rather have bureaucrats, which I am a fan of bureaucrats, but would you rather have bureaucrats who are not elected choosing where that money goes, or would you rather have a member of Congress who is directly connected to a district deciding where that money goes? So yeah, I'm a huge fan of earmarks, and I do think it does grease the wheels of negotiation. And in a hyper-polarized environment, it is an important tool to have.
So I'm in full agreement with you. I think earmarks are great, like within reason. But yeah, and I know there are a lot of them, but I think also it creates a kind of incentive structure for members to like work hard while they're in Washington to try to get stuff done for their actual communities, rather than just laying back and letting either the White House or party leadership totally run the show when it comes to how money is distributed and how taxpayer funds are distributed. And it incentivizes them to look at projects in their district, especially the way we're doing it now, that are actually going to be valuable to their district, that voters are going to see with their eyes what government is doing, and then be able to like create this feedback loop, hopefully of trust between members and their constituents that we know is in like super short supply these days. So I too am pro earmarks, so bring them on. All right, let's go to the Gavel Drop, our last segment before SoRelle and I adjourn. We'll share a couple of potentially unrelated stories from the past week that we are still keeping our eyes on. SoRelle, what's on your mind this week, or rather next week?
Yes, the State of the Union is coming up. Another fun thing required in the Constitution. It's in Article 2. The president must deliver an address to Congress. So President Trump will come and give a speech about his priorities to Congress. This piece by the folks at Politico talk about the Republican messaging. Republicans worry that the shutdown that we've been speaking about will overshadow Trump's State of the Union. Maybe they'll talk about it. Maybe they won't. Maybe he won't show up, right? I don't think that will happen. But the other part of it is, what are Democrats going to do, right? So last year, how did you feel about those little signs, Charlie?
The signs. I mean, I'm really of two minds about it, because like on the one, like we've talked about, they're totally out of power. There is nothing really that they can do. But you had Al Green, the congressman from Texas, standing up and yelling and shaking his cane, which was like a perfect encapsulation of like the age issue in Congress, but that's a whole different thing. But, you had him doing that and sort of disrupting. And the question was like, oh, how should we like heckle him? Should we all like stage a walkout? Last year it was in the midst of all of this kind of Doge style, this was when Elon was like front and center. And, they had little tiny stop signs, basically, that said, different little messages on each side. And my personal least favorite was the one where they just held it up and it just said false, like whenever he said something that wasn't true. And it just felt like very, Washington Post fact-checky kind of schoolmarm kind of protest that I don't find super effective. But it looks like they're going to try a couple of different things this year. A bunch of Democrats are going to boycott and have a rally on the National Mall instead, which sure, I would say go for it. But I'm also skeptical that like basically anything they do could have any kind of practical impact. But they do have to show they're fighting to their base, right? So
For the president, again, they don't have legislative power. They don't have legislative authority. And so this is their chance, very similar to the budget, to get before members of Congress and say, these are my priorities. So it's messaging for the president. It's, it's a negotiation tactic in a way for them. It is a more recent development for it to become the same for members of Congress, right? Even when I worked there, not to age myself, but quite a while ago, got to work on some State of the Unions in the minority and in the majority. And the idea of boycotting, of, holding up signs was not really on the table. I don't know how I feel about it. I don't love that it's kind of circusy, but at the same time, like you said, Democrats have to show they're doing something. I think the quote from Chris Murphy, a senator from Connecticut, these are abnormal times, so we have an abnormal response, right? So, I buy that, but it will be news for 10 days, if that, and then we will, I suppose, move on. But we will see what the White House is going to emphasize. That is something to note that we can learn from it.
I mean, maybe this gets us closer to becoming like the British Parliament, where they're just like shouting and heckling and yelling
at each other. That's true. That could be exciting.
So that's something to aspire to. All right, so my thing that I'm covering this week is all about someone who, a year from now we're going to be hearing a lot less from, and that's Mitch McConnell, who I think for both SoRelle and I, like, growing up following this stuff, McConnell, arguably the most powerful member of Congress in the last 20 years.
Transformed the chamber. I mean, transformed completely. How Senate rules were utilized. I mean, truly a procedural mastermind.
Yeah. I mean, I think about as like capital E effective a member of Congress as you could think of in modern history, which makes what is happening in the race to replace him in the Senate. He's been having health problems. He's quite old at this point. He's announced he's retiring. And so there's this race to replace him in Kentucky. This is presumed to be a really safe Republican seat. And so there's a contentious primary between a number of folks, including David Cameron, the former attorney general, Representative Andy Barr, who is, a pretty outspoken, kind of MAG-oriented member of Congress. There's Nate Morris, a businessman who's backed by a number of sort of influencery MAGA folks. So it's a contentious primary, and they're all, as in a primary, like trying to outdo themselves and how much they love Donald Trump and everything like that. But they also seem to be trying to outdo themselves in terms of trashing Mitch McConnell, who has become really unpopular basically ever since he spoke out against Donald Trump following January 6th, and in a number of other much like smaller ways that still went way beyond what most Republicans were doing. And it's just really interesting in Kentucky politics because like all three of these guys either like were staffers of McConnell's or like had close ties to him, in Kentucky, right? Like the state GOP headquarters is like named after Mitch McConnell. He's been in Congress for like, dozens of years. And it's just been so interesting watching opinion about him just shift on a dime from this like local Republican hero who revived the party and is basically responsible for every single Republican policy victory over the past 20 years.
I mean, the best thing that's happened to conservative politics is the conservative takeover of the Supreme Court, which can be directly attributed to Mitch McConnell.
Yeah, it's like he is singularly responsible for that in terms of how he ran the Senate, which I know like made him like the main villain of Democrats basically until Donald Trump came on the scene. But I don't know if it's like, what have you done for me lately? Or if it's just like a total shift in the identity politics area of the Republican Party. But it's so fascinating watching these three guys like try to outdo themselves in like always referring to how old Mitch McConnell is and how he's like yesterday's news and stuff. And it's so interesting to me as an outsider.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what you mentioned a few weeks ago, which is there's not many people who voted to impeach or against or voted to certify or, all of this in the Republican Party left. And I think this is definitely an example of that. The houseification of the Senate, if you will.
That's right. That's right. Well, with that, I think we'll call it a week, but we will absolutely be back next time. I think we'll be talking elections. We got some exciting primaries coming up, so be sure to join us for that. Thanks, SoRelle, as always, for joining me.
Thank you, Charlie.
And thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time.
Bye.